Hi, I'm John. This is a chapter-by-chapter review of Robin Hobb's Assassin's Apprentice. This review is coming out in conjunction with an actually proper review where I'll summarize the whole book and talk about its plot and characterization and stuff, and you should go listen to that first. Um, Additionally, you shouldn't listen to this review at all if you are scared about spoilers, because I'm spoiling everything. I'm doing a chapter-by-chapter summary, so of course I'm spoiling it. Anyway, four things I noticed about the first chapter. First, Fitz has no dialogue. That's an interesting choice. Fitz is the protagonist. You usually think that you'd want it to have dialogue in the first chapter. I think in the first chapter he said only one word, and that word was boy. This is interesting. This is a good choice by the author. Basically, Fitz is a scared little boy, so of course he's traumatized and doesn't say anything. Second, his not saying anything symbolizes his lack of agency caused by, in these circumstances. His grandpa handed him over to his uncles, and now Fitz didn't have a choice in this matter. Other people are controlling his life now. Okay, number two. I like the subtext of the first chapter. Basically, the subtext, as far as I saw, revolved around Regal. First of all, Regal was dressed up in a fancy doublet, maybe some silks, other fancy clothing. He looked like a nobleman. Comparing him to what Verity was described at. Verity had ink on his fingers. He had some scars on his hands and his face. He wore hunting leathers. He wore riding leathers. He was portrayed to be sensibly clothed and a very active individual. Basically, this presented Regal as being a bit of a twit, whereas Verity was a more sensible person, making Verity more likable just by description. Similarly, Regal also had a bit of dialogue where when he was discussing with Verity that he and Verity should set aside Fitz, which is a code word for saying we should kill him, which is a good way of establishing that that Regal is a bit more covert than Verity, and Regal has ambitions, which was a good way to start out with a character. Okay, number three. In the future, so the book begins as a frame story with Fitz writing down his story. He's doing it as a favor to a woman named Patience. Patience is Fitz's father's wife. However, Patience is not Fitz's mother. It's his stepmother, I guess we'd say. Fitz is a bastard child. So, in the frame story, he's writing down this novel. He's writing this book as a favor to Patience, which means that they are on good terms. However, as the story begins, as Fitz is writing it, when Fitz is a little boy, everyone thinks that Patience will not be happy about Fitz. So it's interesting that in the past, Patience is unhappy with Fitz, but in the future, Patience becomes happy with Fitz. That means that there is character development between the 2 points. Good way to start a book. Finally, I liked the prose. It was good prose. It was a little bit ye olde English flavored. It wasn't really overboard. I like that. It was not purple. It wasn't flowery. It wasn't trite. I'm envious. The author is very skilled. However, I do have to say the author used a little bit too much description for my taste in this chapter. She spent maybe like one or two whole pages before, at the very beginning of the frame story, just talking about walking. No dialogue. I got bored. I can go on, but this is going on for a while. Have a nice day. See you tomorrow. Hi, I'm John. This is chapter 2. Okay, I noted 4 main things about this chapter. First thing first is there was a decline in the quality of the prose, I thought. If I was to make a guess, authors, as a general rule, really polish up their first chapter in order to really bring in the reader, and then after that, there's a decline in quality of the prose throughout basically all published works. I guess that happened here. Moving on, I was happy about the fact that there was less overabundant descriptions in this chapter. It was much more to the point, but still descriptive about the setting. Really brought the setting to life without being overbearing. Next thing, this chapter had really low tension and stakes. This chapter is a series of vignettes about Fitz learning a lot of different skills, like how to fish, how to make nets, how to make boats. Fitz meets Molly. He meets Molly's father. He basically makes friends around town. The point of that was to set the reader. The author's goal was to desensitize the reader and make them think this is a safe situation. She was lulling us into letting our guards down with these happy little memories, so that at the end of the chapter, when Burrich kills, what's his name? Kills the dog, we're more traumatized as a result. That was really smart working by the author. I'll have to pull that own trick sometime on my own readers. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 4. Oh, wait. Chapter 2. But there's one last thing. I noticed that there was a theme of love hurts in chapter 1. Fitz was abandoned by his family in chapter 2. Fitz's father figure kills his dog. The dog didn't actually die, but kills his dog. And we also learn about Molly's abusive family. So there's definitely a theme about love hurts in this book. Anyway, that's enough for chapter 2. Hi, this is John. Time for chapter 3. I did not like this chapter as much. It felt very boring and listless. The plot hasn't really happened yet. The tension and stakes are also pretty low. The pacing is slow. Nothing's happening. I want more to happen by this point in the book. The author stops to smell the roses and talk about and just like indulge in. Well, it's a valid storytelling style that she has. That she stops and smells the roses. She talks about little vignettes and side stories. It's fine. It's very enjoyable. But like, we're 3 chapters in and we're still have vignette after vignette after vignette. I want something to happen. This is getting kind of boring. There's no forward momentum, no propulsion in the story. That's something I value when I like reading books. I like propulsion. I like forward momentum. This doesn't have that. Okay, moving on. I feel as though once again the quality of the prose is not quite up to the standard set by the first chapter. It's still good prose. It's still functional prose. It's very readable. It's very digestible, which is an achievement in and of itself. I don't insult the author. It's just that I really like the first chapter. That was a fantastic first chapter. I want more of that. So the prose wasn't quite up to the level of gorgeousness as the first chapter. Anyway, that's it for chapter 3. See you tomorrow with chapter 4. Hi, it's John. Time for chapter 4. I noticed, 3 main things about this chapter. I'll keep it short this time. First of all, we have the characterization of Jade. He is Fitz's assassination tutor. And what I found was interesting is that of all the tutors presented so far, Jade was by far the only tutor who actually listens to Fitz and lets Fitz have a choice in his education. He's possibly, arguably, the most likable character portrayed so far in this book, barring maybe Fitz, but Fitz doesn't have much of a character so far as of chapter 4, so I don't really count Fitz. This is interesting. I really like this choice by the author because Jade is like an assassin, so the author is going out of her way to portray Jade as being a very upstanding and good character, a likable character, is a good way to portray this trope. Okay, now moving on to my other point, I noticed that the author used 2 strategies of characterization in this particular chapter. First of all, she used blunt force characterization, and second, she used subtle characterization. First, to talk about blunt force characterization, the author more than once hit the nail on the head, and she said that Fitz is lonely. She said that Burrich is lonely. She has the words come out of Jade's mouth. Jade says, "You've guarded your thoughts so well, you're almost afraid to let yourself know what your thoughts are." The author is unafraid of just putting these characters' emotions right out there, giving them to the reader, telling the reader how to read the text. This is a choice. I don't see it very often from authors. It's a valid choice, though. It's appropriate given this example. And here's an example of subtle characterization. At the end of this chapter, there's a conversation between Burrich and Fitz about the subject of chivalry. Fitz's father and Burrich's old lord. Basically, what the conversation was about was Burrich says that chivalry used to lead by example, by being a very good person, by being noble in many ways. and his troops, as a consequence of chivalry's good nature, were good in return. Now, what goes unsaid... Okay, no. First of all, Birch says, Fitz, you should be like that, which is a lot of expectations to put on a little 10-year-old boy. And second of all, what's left unsaid is that Birch, one of chivalry's troops, also held himself to chivalry's standards. So what we know is that chivalry held himself to high standards, and he held his troops to the same high standards. And Birch was one of chivalry's troops. So as a consequence of this, Birch, in my interpretation, Birch doesn't like himself very much. So in my interpretation, it is chivalry's high standards were passed on to Birch, and now Birch is passing on the high standards onto Fitz. So we have like a chain of impossible standards being passed from chivalry, who failed those high standards, are now being passed through Birch, who is failing those standards by getting drunk all the time, and is now being passed on to Fitz. And we learn in future books, at least I think we learn in future books, that Fitz fails those high standards as well. Okay, that's chapter 4. See you for chapter 5 tomorrow. Yeah. Hi guys, time for chapter 5. In today's segment, I want to talk about show, don't tell. In this chapter, the author did a lot of exposition. Now, in writing circles, there's a concept called show, don't tell. In Western literary circles, it's a common refrain that authors should go out of their way to write sub-vignettes to display themes and ideas the book is meant to represent. In yesterday's segment, I mentioned how Hobb, using the mouthpiece of Fitz in Fitz's epistolary format, outright stated that Fitz was lonely. This is an example of telling, not showing. In today's chapter, the narrator of the story discussed how Fitz pulled various pranks around the castle, such as turning laundry inside out and giving people diuretics. Those pranks were told to us, not shown to us. Objectively, there's nothing wrong with telling and not showing. Show don't tell is a modern cultural expectation and not objectively true. Robin Hobb neglecting show don't tell is a valid option. This book is popular enough to have spawned a 9-book series in spite of telling not showing. It's fine. Now that said, I would have enjoyed if the author took a chapter to show one of these pranks. For example, the prank of stealing one of the puppets from the puppeteer would have been fun to watch. Okay, next point. I've noticed that the author is not a big fan of dialogue, or like the verbal repartee between characters, at least so far. This is either because it's part of the author's stylistic voice, or because Fitz is a quiet character and he doesn't say much. Next, I noticed that the author is relying in a big way on Fitz's likability to carry the book. If the reader isn't a fan of the plot, this book's plot, or the slow pacing, and they don't like Fitz, there's not much in this book that the reader would find appealing. And next, I've noticed that this book has the occasional big paragraphs. Like, I'm reading on my Kindle, and it has like a screen that's like this big, and sometimes paragraphs are like longer than an entire page of the screen. That's a big deal. And that's it. See you later. Hi, it's time for chapter 6. This is my favorite chapter so far. Once again, the author employed the strategy of lulling the reader into a sense of complacency by giving them a happy memory. In this case, the happy memories of Fitz talking with Molly. This sense of complacency lowers the reader's mental defenses, so at the end of the chapter, when Fitz learns about his father Shiv's death, that is more impactful upon the Fitz and more impactful upon the reader. Next, I enjoyed the echoing pattern the author used in this chapter. She began the chapter with Jade telling Fitz that he's not allowed to leave Buckkeep because if he does, someone will kill him. Unfortunately, the same rule also applies to Fitz's father, Chivalry. At the beginning of the book, Chivalry left the Buckkeep. As a result, he's no longer under his father's protection. So by leaving Buckkeep, Chivalry allowed his enemies a chance to kill him. This works. This is a nice echoing pattern. I'd like to see more authors use it. I did have a problem about this chapter, though. I wanted the author to talk more about prior civil wars between potential heirs to the Duchy's kingdom. Because the author didn't really talk about specific prior civil wars to the duchies between rival heirs, the threat that Fitz and by proxy Shiv played to Regal and Verity seemed completely theoretical and without teeth. So I'd like to know a specific example. That's it. See you later. Hi, time for Chapter 7. This is my least favorite chapter so far. I found this chapter to be consisting almost entirely of talking heads. What I mean by that is this chapter is basically a lot of dialogue between two characters standing in an empty room doing nothing together. Just talking. I don't find that to be very exciting. Second, this chapter was an amalgamation of 5 scenes stapled together. Previously I stated I wasn't very happy when the author stapled 2 chapters together. This is basically 5. The 5 scenes were Fitz and Birch talking, then Fitz and Jade talking, then Fitz and Birch talking again, and Fitz and the Fool talking, and then finally Fitz and Jade talking for a second and final time. Now these scenes weren't bad per se, but they weren't particularly inspired either. To paraphrase Brandon Sanderson from his Writing Excuses podcast, every chapter should have the potential to be that reader's favorite chapter in the book. This chapter is so bland, I don't think anyone would think this is their favorite chapter. This chapter felt very obviously like a narrative glue chapter, meaning this chapter was the link between Chivalry's death on one hand and the next chapter, which is the beginning of Fitz's first assassination mission, on the other. So it was the glue in between. The author was explaining what happened in the last chapter and explaining what's going to happen in the next chapter. And finally, moving on to the fact about this is so obvious a mystery, we have King Shrewd's characterization as a result takes a hit. The fact that this mystery is so obvious that the Queen did it makes Shrewd's unwillingness to do anything about it to avenge his dead son makes Shrewd seem either powerless or stupid. The Queen, according to the text of this book, has repeatedly stated in public that she is willing to go into open rebellion and found her own kingdom. The King, combining this information with the fact that his son just died, should just realized who did this. Shrewd, according to the text, is both powerful and shrewd. According to Jade, Shrewd is willing to kill his own grandson if that's what it takes to secure the duchies. It therefore stands to reason that Shrewd should be willing to assassinate his own wife. Further, Shrewd should have seen his son's death coming and prevented it. In the light of it having happened, he now should do something to avenge his son, but he doesn't. As a result, Shrewd seems like a very weak and ineffectual character, which is not in keeping with how he has been portrayed so far. Shrewd's characterization as a result seems bad. Now maybe there's a character dynamic here that I'm not aware of. Maybe Shrewd is aware that the Queen killed him, but he needs the Queen alive anyway because the Queen is how he holds the duchies together. However, I can't assume this power dynamic to be true because the author hasn't actually stated it. Okay, that's Chapter 7. See you tomorrow for Chapter 8. Okay, this is Chapter 8. This is my second favorite chapter so far. I love Lady Time in this chapter. She's hilarious. From my previous read of this book, I remember the twist involving Lady Time, which makes this chapter all the more funny and helps develop Jade as a character. Now, once again, I feel obliged to complain about the fact that this chapter feels like 2 chapters were stapled together, but now I'm beginning to sense the pattern. The author tends to take her smaller chapters and fuse them together like that. And it's getting to the point that the author does this so often that I've realized it's just part of her narrative voice. As it's part of her narrative voice, I can't in good conscience complain about it. So I'll just say I personally would prefer that the author separated this into 2 small chapters, but it's not a big deal. Finally, I feel as though in this section of the story, for maybe 1 or 2 chapters before this as well, the prose has not been as stylish or as beautiful or as semi-anachronistic as it was earlier in the book. I liked those earlier chapters for their prose style. Yeah, I wish the author spent a little bit more time on these chapters just throwing some spice in there. That's it. See you for next chapter. Hi, Chapter 9. Let's do this. I enjoyed this chapter, but I had 2 major problems with it. First, in this chapter, the major plot arc about Kelvar the Duke and his wife the Duchess ended in this chapter. I didn't like how it just kind of ended and there wasn't a denouement. If I were a critic or an editor giving advice to the author, I'd suggest that she go back and give some more denouement to that plot arc. For a couple chapters now, I've been having trouble with this book. The plot and the pacing has been seeming a little boring. Personally, I attribute this listlessness to the lack of tension and stakes brought on by the lack of antagonists or a lack of a looming threat in this story. To fix this, In the second half of this chapter, we're introduced to the concept of the Red Ship Raiders and them attacking a place called Forge. I would have moved that incident from here in chapter 9 to maybe in chapter like 4 or 5, just so that it starts earlier in the story so we have a sense of a looming threat happening in the background. Introducing the Red Ship Raiders earlier would add tension to and stakes to earlier points in the story, meaning that in the background we'd have this unresolved problem going on in the background, so that the reader, if the reader does get bored, they'll always have a promise in the back of their head thinking, but wait, the Red Ship Raiders are still out there. We still need to resolve this problem. That's it. See you for chapter 10. Hi guys, it's time for chapter 10. I thought this chapter is about average. There have been better chapters and there have been worse chapters. I liked how Jade received characterization in this chapter. He started using drugs in order to stay awake and work very hard. This is good characterization. It shows how he's willing to put everything on the line to do his job, even though he knows that he'll crash after he takes the drugs. I did not really like how the author introduced the Forge. In this case, the author told but didn't show how the Forge are cruel and they're petty and they're vicious. I would have preferred if the author had the Forged attack Fitz and attack Jade. That's it. See you for the next chapter. Right. Chapter 11. I'm beginning to sense a pattern in the author's writing style. Namely, she tends to go in between major plot arcs. She tends to default back to having small, low-pressure chapters in which she has the characters get caught up on events and introduces the next plot arc. In this chapter, the narrator, Fitz, spoke with Jade, with Burrich, with Molly, and at the end with an unknown woman who I'm guessing is Patience. I don't really remember well enough to tell, but all signs indicate Patience. In this chapter, the low-pressure, low-tension scene was Fitz talking with Molly and talking about the events which happens in Forged, as well as Fitz and Molly talking about the state of Buckkeep City, or Buckkeep Town. This was useful in order to further flesh out events both in the town as well as in the Buckkeep Keep itself. Okay, speaking of Buckkeep, we need to talk about King Shrewd. Once again, he's taken a hit in the characterization department. At the beginning of the book, he is portrayed as a paranoid individual who's willing to kill his own grandson in order to keep the kingdom together. However, in the wake of his wife's death and his son's death, he's apparently taken a hit to the intelligence meter. I don't know how to say it, but he's like, if Fitz can see it and if Jade can see it, Regal is obviously a problem child, but the king doesn't see that, and that makes the king less compelling, at least to me. And speaking at the same note, the author did something clever with Regal in this chapter. Regal is a very surface-level, expensive character who likes spending money. Going back a chapter or two to when we had the Duchess of Kelvar, she also liked spending money. However, the Duchess of Kelvar was able to redeem herself through the actions of Fitz, whereas no one is apparently taking the same step with Regal. The king should be taking the step, but he hasn't. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the way this is going. It's a good characterization by the author, but it's undermining Shrewd for me as a character. This chapter was kind of boring, truth be told. Not much happened. Fitz and Molly went out on a date, and that was basically the climax of the entire chapter. It worked. It wasn't memorable, though. Anyway, see you for the next chapter. Okay, chapter 12. This is a big talky chapter, and ordinarily I don't really like talky chapters without much action. I did by and large like this chapter. First of all, the author used a lot of subtext in her dialogue. For example, Patience called Burrich a drunk and a lecher, maybe leading me to think that maybe there was some sort of history between Patience and Burrich. Second, I enjoyed how the author is when the author likes to write descriptions in basically all the chapters as far as I can remember. And a lot of the descriptions are very cozy and homey. I think this coziness and hominess is part of the reason why this series is so popular. It's really easy to sink your tendrils into this book and enjoy it on a textual level. But there's one thing I didn't really like about the chapter, specifically the introduction of Galen. How do I put this? The author told and not showed showed Galen. Presumably he'll be introduced in the next chapter or in a chapter later than that. So it was weird that we had a section about Galen before he was actually introduced. I think it would have been better if the author introduced Galen first, let us get our negative first impression of Galen, and then have this conversation after. That's it. See you for the next chapter. Okay, this is chapter 13. This is arguably my favorite chapter in the book so far. Basically, this chapter is short, sweet, and to the point, and I really enjoyed that. The author set out with the goal of introducing Patience in a very compelling manner, and she did so. She described the character by describing her surroundings. Patience lives in a mildly cluttered room. I say as I sit in a mildly cluttered room. And this describes Patience's personality as being in a state of havoc and chaos. She's constantly bouncing from one thing to the next in order to entertain herself or something. Basically, I got the sense that maybe Patience is on the autistic spectrum, or maybe she has ADHD or something else like that. I don't really know. I can't really pathologize someone correctly. I'm not a doctor. Anyway, Patience is clearly a fascinating character. She loves chivalry deeply. Now she seems to want to be near Fitz because he's the closest living proxy for Shiv. Yeah, see you for the next chapter. Right, this is chapter 14. This is one of the best written scenes so far. I found it to be very emotionally evocative. Fitz gets bullied in this scene by Galen. One thing I've noticed is that the narrative really goes out of its way to make Galen seem evil. This book is told in an epistolary format, meaning that this book was ostensibly written by Fitz. So when the narrator of this book goes out of his way to make Galen seem evil, really it's Fitz who's going out of his way to make Galen seem evil. Now you remember earlier I mentioned blunt force characterization several chapters ago. In this case, the blunt force characterization was done by Fitz, and I suspect deliberately. Fitz was wanting to make you, the reader, or me, the reader, understand that Galen was a really bad person beforehand. This brings in an element of perhaps an unreliable narrator. Maybe Galen wasn't as evil as Fitz makes him out to be. The book only gets away with this blunt force characterization because of the epistolary format. Okay, one last thing. Galen is portrayed as an Umbridge-like character, but without any of Umbridge's hidden nastiness. Where Umbridge is basically petty control freak and hides it underneath a layer of pink and kitten china, Galen's just nasty. He doesn't pretend to be anything that he's not. Galen is so monochromatically petty and vindictive, I don't find him to be a very compelling antagonist, as he would be otherwise. This leaves me wondering, why is Galen so petty and vindictive? I like my villains to have some nuance, and so far Galen doesn't really seem to be the hero of his own story. The same is true for Regal. If I were this book's editor, I'd suggest the author introduce Galen earlier in the book and include some softer scenes with him to make him seem like not such a monochromatic jerk. Okay, see you next chapter. Yeah, so chapter 15. This was one of my favorite chapters in the book so far. Most notably, I felt that the author handled tension really well in this chapter. The chapter started with tension at medium, with Fitz's indoctrination into Galen's cult. The tension spiked when Fitz and Galen dueled in their mind. The tension slumped with Fitz's defeat and then falling recovery. And then the tension had a chance to mellow out when Fitz visited Molly. This gave the reader a much-needed breather in between spikes. And after that, the tension started to increase again when Burrich and the Fool encouraged Fitz to confront Galen again. In my personal experience, tension is at its best when it comes in cycles of low, medium, and then high tension, and then back to low tension. I like these cycles of tension because it gives the reader both intense, memorable moments, but also slow moments, where the reader can breathe and process the traumatic stuff which just happened in the intense moments. I liked Fitz's characterization in this chapter. In this chapter, Fitz changed. He began this chapter confident in his talent with the skill, and after his duel with Galen, he lost his confidence. If you read this on the surface level, Fitz lost his confidence because he suffered a setback and now doubts himself. This is understandable. But if you actually look at the subtext, you might suspect that Galen used his skill to mind control Fitz into feeling depression and self-doubt. Okay, that's the chapter. See you tomorrow. Yeah, so chapter 16. I did not like this chapter. Going back to what I said about a previous chapter, this chapter felt like a connector chapter. Going from the previous chapter, in which Fitz lost his duel, and the next chapter, in which Fitz is tested again at his skill. In this chapter, nothing happens but an explanation of what will happen in the next chapter. Nothing happens in this chapter. It's very plot light. There's some progression in the story. It is revealed that Verity is sick, and it's also revealed that Verity is getting married. I think that this chapter should have been deleted, and the plot points of Verity being sick and Verity getting married should have been moved to a later chapter or to an earlier chapter. That's it. See you in the next chapter. Hi everyone, this is chapter 17. This was actually a really great chapter. I noticed two major things about it. First, the tension. I talked about this in an early chapter, but this is another one that did it very well. First of all, the tension started at a medium level when Fitz was abandoned in Forge by Galen's troops. Then the tension declined and became low when Fitz visited the beach and settled in. Then the tension spiked really high when Fitz dreamed that Burrich was being stabbed, and Fitz needed to return home to save him. The tension then became higher when Fitz was attacked by the Forged. Then Fitz took a nap, causing the tension to go down again, which is good because it gave the reader an opportunity to relax and take a breath. Then when Fitz witnesses the Red Ship Raiders and Fitz is attacked for a second time by the Forged, that causes the tension to spike again. And then finally, when the tension bottoms out, when Fitz walks home to Buck Keep. As I mentioned earlier, having constantly variable levels of tension in a story keeps things unpredictable, which is interesting to read. The second thing I liked about this chapter was what happened after Fitz returned home. First of all, Fitz's dog died protecting Burrich. Second, Burrich disowns Fitz. Third, Molly has started dating another guy after Fitz basically strung her along in the last time that he spoke with her. And fourth, Jade and Patience don't have time for Fitz anymore. All of these put together serve as being a narrative kick in the teeth, especially when combined with the fact that Fitz just failed his skill test. From a structural perspective, the narrative story beat of the kick in the teeth occurs after the midpoint climax. The reason why you use the kick in the teeth story beat is that it serves as the emotional nadir of the story. In short, this is the darkest before the dawn moment. I hope. Okay, I have one major bad part about this chapter. Do you know the horror movie trope of this movie's plot could be solved if everyone just picked up a phone and talked to one another for 5 minutes? I'm getting that sort of vibe from this book right now. Basically, Fitz is being abused by Galen a lot, and I'm left wondering, why doesn't someone just call the king and say, your grandson is being almost assassinated, you should probably step in and stop this. I had the same complaint with Chivalry, I now have the same complaint with Fitz. It feels like a massive plot hole. This seems like a plot hole to me. However, I see the reason for the author including this plot hole. The author wanted to isolate Fitz from his protectors. Burrich is no longer protecting him. Jade has started ignoring him. Patience has basically disowned him as well. Put together, Fitz is on his own, and this serves as an emotional nadir, like I said. Anyway, that's it. See you later. Yeah, chapter 18. I personally enjoyed this chapter, but I felt it had its flaws. This was another connector chapter. The prior chapter was Fitz's test at the skill. The next chapter will be Fitz traveling with Verity to have Verity get married. Both of these are important plot-active events, plot-active chapters, whereas this chapter was just kind of the interstitial knitting together of events which happened in between. It was very low action. Instead, this chapter is very slice of life and closey. This chapter follows Fitz as he goes around his chores around the duchies and around Buckkeep, poisoning people, poisoning Forged. Unlike prior connector chapters, I actually enjoyed this one. The reason being is because the author chose to explore the relationship between Fitz, between Verity, the king, and Regal. It becomes clear that the king favors Regal, and maybe even would prefer Regal to be on the throne or to be next in line for the throne instead of Verity. It is shown that Verity very much so resents Regal, which I like. Interpersonal conflict between characters is always a plus in my book. I also like the subtext of Verity potentially being worked to death by the king at the skill. I was thinking maybe it's possible that the king is trying to get Verity killed so Regal can inherit the throne, which is an interesting idea. I don't necessarily think it's true, but I honestly hope it winds up being true, because that would make the king's neglect that I talked about in the last couple chapters, a lot more sensible, in my opinion. It would change the king from being one of my least favorite characters to my most favorite, because it would put in context his neglectful behavior. One last thing. This chapter is too long. It was the longest chapter in this book, and it just felt too long. Besides it, that's it. See you later. Yeah, so this is chapter 19. Overall, I thought this was a bit of a dull chapter. Not much happened, but it does promise that things will happen in the chapters to come. Now that said, this chapter did have some good aspects. So I've finally come around, and I like King Shrewd as a character. In prior chapters, I complained about the fact that we have been told that King Shrewd is shrewd, but we have not been shown that King Shrewd is shrewd. In this chapter, I've finally come to the realization that there might be a reason for this. I think it is a possible character interpretation for the character of King Shrewd that he is an actively neglectful character who cares more about his personal power than he does actually care about his family. I think King Shrewd is a fantastic villain. I think he's this book's main antagonist. He's emotionally manipulative and corrupts Fitz, turning Fitz into an assassin. In prior chapters, I complained about the fact that no one went forward to King Shrewd and told him about the abuse that Fitz was undergoing at Galen's hands. In this chapter, that finally happened. Verity went to Shrewd and told him that Fitz was being abused. And what happened was the king brushed it under the rug. I like this turn of events because it makes Shrewd look like a bad person. This makes him seem like a villain, if not an outright antagonist, the primary antagonist in this story. Further in this chapter, we learn that Fitz is about to be sent to assassinate a prince, and this assassination is purely for political gain, not for justice or any other high-minded reason. Shrewd wants this prince to die so he can gain personal power, and he's willing to risk Fitz's life to do so. It is suggested in the subtext of this chapter that this is a suicide mission. King Shrewd is willing to send his own grandson to die in order to increase his personal power. All the problems that I've had with Shrewd as a character up until this point have suddenly been fixed. I like him suddenly. He's a horrible person, and it makes his antagonism makes his neglect and his abuse makes so much more sense. I think I see what the author is going for. I think Shrewd is supposed to be the antagonist of this book. Okay, that's it for this chapter. See you around. Hey everyone. I skipped a couple chapters back for a couple days, so I'm going to get caught up all at once and do them all at once. Chapter 19. I liked this chapter. In this chapter, Fitz went to Kyurja. I don't actually know how to pronounce that name. Went to the Mountain Kingdom, where he met Princess Kettrikin. Princess Kettrikin poisoned him. I like this turn of events. What happened was Regal told Kettrikin that Fitz is a poisoner and there to kill her brother. Kettrikin, having agency, decided to take matters into her own hands and kill Fitz. This makes Princess Kettrikin seem like a 3D person with goals, aspirations, and her own mind. This is good characterization as far as I'm concerned. Okay, let's move on to chapter 20. That was chapter 20. Never mind. Moving on to chapter 21. In chapter 21, there's the realization that, first of all, Nosy is still alive, which is a pleasant surprise. And second, even though Fitz's cover has been blown, and it is now widely known that Fitz is an assassin, Regal wants Fitz to go through with the assassination plot. Of course, if Prince Rurisk, Fitz's assassination target, dies, Fitz will get all the blame for it. Naturally, Fitz doesn't want to do this, so he asks Regal not to, but Regal puts his foot down. It's at this point Fitz finally realized that Regal's up to no good and Regal just wants Fitz dead. I like this turn of events somewhat. It makes Regal seem very two-dimensional, hollowly evil, but it also does serve to up the stakes in the plot going to the final chapters. Okay, going to the next chapter. In this chapter, it's called Dilemma. Fitz is faced with a simple dilemma. Does he obey Prince Regal and die, or does he disobey Prince Regal and die? Fitz no longer has a choice in the matter. In the end, he decides to put his heart on a platter, approach Prince Rurisk, tell him that he's the target of assassination, and Fitz possibly dies along with him. I liked this. It was a very realistic reaction to what happened. Fitz feels hopeless, and in the face of that hopelessness, he decides to have it out with his supposed enemy who he really respects. This is a good turn of events. Okay, going on to the next chapter. Prince Rurisk has died, and Regal now tries to kill Fitz as well. Except Fitz survives. It is finally revealed the three parts of Regal's assassination plan. First, he kills Prince Rurisk, and he blames Fitz. In reprisal, Fitz is killed. And third, Prince Regal's brother Galen assassinates Verity. And then finally, when Verity is dead, Prince Regal can marry Princess Ketrikin and become the heir apparent to the throne. And moving to the final chapter, the denouement. I did not like this chapter. If you've read very many of my reviews, you will realize that I like long, extended denouements. A denouement is a falling action after the final climax where there are lots of little scenes of stuff happening. Going into this book has been very slow. The author has taken her time to go talk about individual events and cozy events of everyday life. I thought that we'd get more of that in this climax. That would be something I would enjoy very much. Instead, the author did a lot of showing, not telling. Absolutely nothing happened in the final chapter. It was all telling. It was all narration. I wanted a slow letdown of events. Instead, there was the author telling the reader a lot of events which happened. In my opinion, I would have liked something else. Okay, that's my chapter by chapter review of this book. I'll see you later.